Hi, everybody. Dave here. Just a quick reminder that if you are only listening to the CyberWire podcast, there's more to the story. You should visit our website and check out our CyberWire Daily News Brief. You can have it delivered to your email every day. Go to thecyberwire.com and check it out there. It's our daily news brief. Take a look. Thanks. The group behind the Wipro attack has been active since 2015. Office 365 are still being targeted by account takeover attacks. A third-party Android app store is serving malware. The UK Defense Secretary has been sacked over leaked information. The US warned Russia to cease its support of Venezuela's Chavista regime. Russia's Internet Sovereignty Bill is signed into law. And notes on the Global Cyber Innovation Summit. Time for a message from our sponsor, Bandura Cyber. Are you using threat intelligence, or is threat intelligence using you? Threat intelligence gateways, or TIGs, are an exciting emerging network security technology that take the heavy lifting out of making threat intelligence actionable, operational, and useful. TIGs aggregate IP and domain indicators of compromise from an unlimited number of sources, such as DHS, information sharing groups like FS, MS, or ONG-ISAC, commercial sources like Webroot or Anomaly, or even your own internal IOCs from your SIM or TIP. With the need for multiple sources and views of threat intelligence now more important than ever, and with existing solutions' limited ability to ingest and block third-party IOCs at scale, TIGs make taking action with massive volumes of threat intelligence easy. Get the definitive guide to this next-generation technology, Operationalizing Threat Intelligence, an in-depth guide to threat intelligence gateways at banduracyber.com/cyberwire. A bonus? It's written by our friends at Bandura Cyber. They're the company that started the TIG category. And it's free. Again, that's banduracyber.com/cyberwire. And we thank Bandura Cyber for sponsoring our show. From the CyberWire studios at Data Tribe, I'm Dave Bittner with your CyberWire summary for Thursday, May 2nd, 2019. Flashpoint reveals finding from its inquiry into the attack on IT outsourcing and consulting company Wipro. The threat actors behind it have been active since 2015. A URL in a phishing document led researchers to infrastructure used in previous attack campaigns. The goal of the Wipro attack and subsequent attacks against Wipro's customers appears to be gift card fraud. Flashpoint says the attackers were seeking access to the portals that manage gift cards and rewards programs at the targeted organizations. Barracuda is the latest to point out active attacks against users of Microsoft Office 365. Account takeover attacks surged during March. The attackers are opportunistic. Brute forcing, credential stuffing, and social engineering are all in play. Zscaler warns against a third-party Android app store seemingly specializing in games. It's simply a front for a campaign to install malware into too trusting victims' devices. The smart content store isn't a smart place to shop and doesn't even offer real content. If you try to download Crazy Birds or Super Bros Run, you won't even get a Trojanized game. All you'll install is malware. The Times reports that UK Defense Secretary Williamson has been fired after investigation indicated he was the cabinet member who talked out of school about Huawei. Prime Minister Theresa May said that, quote, no other credible version of events to explain this leak has been identified, end quote. Williamson denies the claims and blames his sacking on a kangaroo court rigged by mandarins who had it in for him. He'll be succeeded by Penny Mordaunt. After a failed attempt by Venezuela's constitutional acting president to oust President Maduro failed, the Times reports that the U.S. has warned Russia not to continue attempts to prop up the Chavista regime. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Tuesday accused Russia of persuading Maduro to abandon his plan to flee to Cuba. Russian President Vladimir Putin yesterday signed into law a bill which will see Russia develop an independent internet infrastructure. The law is meant to ensure that the country can stay online in case its adversaries decide to cut it off from the global internet. Internet service providers will have to install special equipment supplied by the Russian government, which will enable them to rely on Russia's alternative DNS and route all traffic through local servers when the government deems it necessary. Most observers assume that the more practical uses of the law will involve censorship and traffic monitoring, although Moscow denies this. The law isn't popular among the Russian people. ZDNet cites a recent poll that found only 23% of Russians support the measure. Security Operations Centers, or SOCs, continue to develop and evolve in their scope and complexity, with many organizations adopting a more collaborative approach. Cody Cornell is co-founder and CEO at Swimlane, a security orchestration, automation, and response firm, and he joins us to help explain.
SOC is a security operations center, so basically a group of individuals, sometimes analysts and engineers, that are responsible for monitoring the security posture of an organization. So we spend a lot of resources on threat detection and threat monitoring technologies, and those alerts have to go to somebody, and that's typically the SOC.
At what point in an organization's life cycle do they typically stand up their own SOC?
Organizations really differ in when they decide it's important, right? We see, really large organizations that you would typically expect to have a lot of security analysts and a large SOC, really not, either using managed services or doing it, with a few people. And then you have, sometimes a smaller organization that is, maybe the IP, intellectual property, is the backbone of their organization. They'll invest heavily in a security operations center in an early phase. So, typically it's, mid-sized to larger organizations that have a dedicated SOC, but you see that across the spectrum of different organizations and different sizes.
So today we're focusing on this notion of collaborative SOCs. What's the differentiator there?
Historically, we've seen, organizations move towards a little bit more sharing, right? So threat intelligence sharing and things along those lines. Organizations really will benefit from the fact that, one group of people, no matter how big it is, if it's 10, 20, 50, 100 people, really don't have a monopoly on all the good ways to thwart adversaries. And the ability for them to collaborate across organizations on what they're seeing and how they're responding really, enables, organizations that may be competitive in the marketplace actually collaborate on security and really help the whole security, operations function across organizations.
Now, is there a natural resistance there? I can imagine organizations, especially when it comes to interacting with their competitors, that they might want to keep their cards close to their vest.
I think there's a tendency to think that that's the case, but we see if it's banks or retail organizations or a variety of verticals actually collaborate. You see a lot of collaboration in the government. You see a lot of collaboration in the energy and utility sector. Do they share everything? Absolutely not. But, how I'm detecting something, how I'm responding to it, what the good sources for investigation information are, those are all things that we see people sharing across organizations, regardless of their competitive. I think most verticals at this point have established an ISAC, so an information sharing organization around threat intelligence. I think that's maturing a lot to include what, is typically called a course of action. So what to do when we see bad. And, I think that's a great place to start. Obviously, a lot of the vendors in the community have started building communities within their product stacks and their portfolios. And I think that's a great place to contribute. And then all the classic places that people contribute, if it's GitHub or otherwise, there's lots of resources out there for contributing and collaborating.
Are there any misconceptions that people have that you run across when it comes to this sort of collaboration?
I think there's a kind of a misnomer that people aren't excited to share, or that people aren't willing to share. And I think that's actually not the case. There's a lot of organizations that, they're investing heavily in protecting their organization, but they understand that sharing is a raising tides, raises all ships moment for them. And the ability to share and collaborate on how to do things and how to respond and how to build playbooks and all these things are really enabling organizations to do more with the same amount of resources. And I think the fact that that's coming to fruition is a surprise to some folks who haven't seen that historically.
That's Cody Cornell from Swimlane. Today is the second and final day of the Global Cyber Innovation Summit in Baltimore's Fells Point. If yesterday's focus was on security technology, today's is much more on the threat. Author and cybersecurity expert Richard Clark opened the conference this morning with a discussion about some of the conclusions he reached in his forthcoming book, Fifth Domain. He observed that his earlier book, Cyber War, written with Robert Knake and published in 2010, had drawn scoffing reviews as being nothing more than alarmist fiction. He noted with satisfaction that much of what they predicted, especially their claim that we'd soon see the rise of military offensive operations in cyberspace, including attacks on infrastructure, had been borne out by the events of the last few years. But, interestingly, he wanted to draw attention to some of the positive developments that he and his co-author did not foresee. Specifically, he argued that the last few years had shown that existing technology properly applied can indeed defend the corporate network. He has seen that appropriate levels of investment in cybersecurity by corporate leadership that understands the risk to the company can make security a priority, and when that happens, companies are generally successful in fending off attacks. And he argued that companies should defend themselves and not expect Cyber Command or other elements of the U.S. military to protect them in cyberspace. He offered a sourly realistic review of military failures to protect their own weapons and networks, and suggested that this argued that the military is not the place to look for defense of the private sector. He did note language in a recent Defense Authorization Act that observed that the U.S. military was authorized in effect to hack adversary systems in peacetime, and he viewed this as a positive sign that the government lawyers, as he characterized them, who had regarded such offensive cyber action as illegal under Title X, have been effectively overruled. He said, quote, "Now there's every reason to think Cyber Command is doing that. They weren't doing that before." End quote. He closed with general observations on conflict and with a plea for an understanding of how the federal government can help. Reflecting on his early career in nuclear arms control negotiation, he remarked that, quote, "Crisis instability comes when an aggressor thinks it can win," end quote. When the offense thinks it has an advantage and the defense isn't credible, you're in a dangerous phase. He saw 3 areas in which federal action can make a positive contribution. First, appropriate regulation, particularly in electrical power and election security. Clark sees the potential for regulation to have the sort of positive effects he argued it had on the financial sector. Second, investment in research, particularly in defense artificial intelligence and machine learning. And third, in diplomacy. There were some genuine achievements in arms control during the Cold War, and Clark thinks there are reasons to hope for comparable diplomatic success with respect to cyber conflict. We'll have more accounts of the summit's proceedings over the next several days. Now it's time for a few words from our sponsor, BlackBerry Cylance. They're the people who protect our own endpoints here at the Cyberwire, and you might consider seeing what BlackBerry Cylance can do for you. You probably know all about legacy antivirus protection. It's very good as far as it goes, but you know what? The bad guys know all about it too. It will stop the skids, but to keep the savvier hoods hands off your endpoints, BlackBerry Cylance thinks you need something better. Check out the latest version of Cylance Optics. It turns every endpoint into its own security operations center. Cylance Optics deploys algorithms formed by machine learning to offer not only immediate protection, but security that's quick enough to keep up with the threat by watching, learning, and acting on systems behavior and resources. Whether you're worried about advanced malware, commodity hacking, or malicious insiders, Cylance Optics can help. Visit Cylance.com to learn more, and we thank BlackBerry Cylance for sponsoring our show. And joining me once again is Jonathan Katz. He's a professor of computer science at the University of Maryland and also director of the Maryland Cybersecurity Center. Jonathan, it's great to have you back. I saw an article from Slate recently. It was called Give Up the Ghost, and it was about a plan in the UK to break encryption or add, I guess, a backdoor to encryption. And they're referring to something called ghost encryption. What's going on here?
So as we know, there's a lot of discussion in the US and the UK and in Australia and other countries as well about the extent to which products offering encryption should be weakened in order to allow this special access for law enforcement. And I guess what's going on here is that there's been a new proposal about a way to try to allow access to certain conversations by law enforcement officials without necessarily weakening encryption on the whole. And it's sort of an interesting idea. What seems, they didn't put technical details out, so it's just kind of a high-level sketch of what they're thinking. But it seems like what they're talking about is something that would not weaken encryption for all conversations that people are having, but basically allow them to choose a specific sender or receiver and weaken conversations that person is having with other people. And so that could be perhaps a way to try to strike a balance between the needs both for encryption in general, but also for this access when needed.
So is this a situation where, say, law enforcement would need to do the equivalent of asking a judge for a warrant, and then this different kind of encryption would be put into motion so that they could then decrypt things?
Yeah, something like that. So that's my understanding, is that they would have to get a warrant, and then they would approach the company actually that's providing the platform where this communication is being done, and then they would essentially ask this platform to weaken the encryption or weaken the protocol being used for some particular pair of sender and receiver. And that way it would allow law enforcement to target that particular conversation without necessarily degrading security for the other conversations taking place.
And in terms of the actual encryption going on there, what's your take on this? Is this a good compromise?
Well, it's a compromise, I'll say that. Whether it's a good compromise or not depends on the details.
Yeah.
I think certainly it does at least partly address some of the concerns that people have raised with other proposals, namely that they would weaken encryption for everybody, and if the single master key falls into the wrong hands, then it could potentially be disastrous. Here, it looks like there is no central master key to be stolen. Rather, it does depend on trusting the company, trusting this company providing the service, that they will only weaken encryption when specifically requested with a warrant in place, and otherwise would leave other conversations alone. So you're putting a little bit more trust in the company, but nevertheless, it represents maybe just a different point on the spectrum, perhaps striking a better balance than other proposals.
Yeah, and I guess with all these things, the devil's in the details.
Yeah, that's right. It obviously depends a lot on how exactly the process is managed and what the technical details are when they come to light.
Well, Jonathan Katz, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's the Cyberwire. Thanks to all of our sponsors for making the Cyberwire possible, especially our supporting sponsor, Observit, the leading insider threat management platform. Learn more at observit.com. The Cyberwire podcast is proudly produced in Maryland out of the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technology. Our Cyberwire editor is John Petrick, social media editor Jennifer Iben, technical editor Chris Russell, our staff writer is Tim Nodar, executive editor Peter Kilpie, and I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening.